Today we're going to be talking about what's coming up in Node.js 12, 0.12, and then I'm going to go through a little bit of my game development experience, which is pretty minor, but I think I have some things that I can share. I don't have an update on the road to Node.js. I did ask them if Chicago could be one of the cities, and we're still talking about it. When I talked to them about it months ago, they were definitely interested in stopping at Chicago, but I don't know if that's still the plan or not. But it would be pretty cool if they come. Before we get started, does anyone want to also present today on anything that they're working on? It could just be a quick little demo or anything like that. Well, if you think of something, let me know. If anyone's interested in presenting anything in the future, also let me know. I don't always have to be the one presenting. I'd be perfectly happy to let someone else do it. And that can be on all kinds of different topics. We can talk about whatever you're interested in. But that's about it. Any questions before we get started?
What's the road to Node?
Oh, that's a good question. So Node.js on the road. I think they changed the name. So this is basically a traveling tour of meetups, sort of. So they're bringing some of the big Node people, like TJ Fontaine's at all of them so far. Ben Acker's at a couple, just DevGlass, some other people who you might recognize in the community. And basically they're just driving them around to speak at different locations. So the next one's March 18th in Seattle, then they're going to do one in Portland. And that's all that's officially scheduled so far. But it seems cool. So this is basically just to go around and promote Node before. The original idea was to build up for like a 1.0 release, but it looks like that's not going to happen until later in the year. But mostly to promote 0.12 and Node in general, and should be cool. So if that happens, I think it's likely going to be here, not in one of our bigger rooms in Groupon. But again, I don't know for sure. There we go. So 0.12, if you aren't familiar with the version numbers of Node specifically, they follow a stable, unstable pattern where odd numbers are unstable and even numbers are stable. So people will upgrade from 0.8 to 0.10 and 0.10 to 0.12. And if you're using one of the odd numbers, you're probably not using it in production. You're just testing it out, playing with the new features, stuff like that. So 0.12 is most likely going to be the last stable release before 1.0. There's no date on 1.0, but the feeling is probably much later this year. But we're getting there. The changes, as you'll see, are much more performance-based and much less changing or adding APIs. There will be an 0.13, which I won't talk about much because I haven't said anything much about it, other than it's basically just going to be a performance bug fix type of release. Just try to make sure everything's stable and solid before they call something 1.0. So the things I'm going to talk about in 0.12 range from what I consider the more boring stuff, and then we'll progress to the more interesting stuff. Performance isn't boring per se. It's just there's not a whole lot to say about it. You just say this is faster, and if you want to know why, you can go in and look at the actual changes and the discussion about why, and that can be interesting too. But for the most part, I'm just going to mention that these things are now faster. The cluster module is, well, it's in core now, but it's a mechanism for spawning off multiple processes and having a master control the children, and basically having a way of taking advantage of multiple CPUs on a system. It's very common in production systems. A lot of people use it that way. But the scheduler for it would basically leave it up to the operating system to determine which actual process received any individual connection. And the operating system, for the most part, preferred to give the same process more connections because it didn't have to do the overhead of waking up other processes. So That's not exactly what most people expect it to do or want, so they're changing the default to do round robin controlled by the master as opposed to leaving it up to the operating system to decide. You can revert it back to the old schedule if you want. And on Windows, it uses the old one because the round robin actually does have too much of a performance impact on Windows specifically. TLS, I actually don't know a whole lot about TLS in general, but it's a successor to SSL, and that's faster for various reasons, and so are crypto algorithms. They basically they either wrote parts of it in more native code or they used a better algorithm or whatever it was, but those are faster. Garbage collection, it uses some different metrics for determining like when it can clean things up, and those allow it to call things left off. And so it's when you do garbage collection, it will take much less of, well, not much, but a significant amount less of your CPU, which is nice. All of the timer systems, set immediate, process.next tick, stuff like that, are also a little bit faster for various reasons, not super interesting. And then they redid the buffer class, and it's based on Smolik, which is a new system for allocating memory outside of the normal JavaScript mechanisms. I don't know a ton about that, but apparently it will allow you to create your own buffer-like classes and be able to do something cool with them. But I don't know a lot about that. Async listener is a mechanism for, I was having trouble actually understanding the benefits of this as well. It's a mechanism for attaching state to an event that gets emitted as it goes into C++ land and then comes back out into JavaScript land, which sounds weird, and for most people you probably wouldn't even think about why you would want something like that. And it's actually going to be a private API inside of Node for now, and then you can use different modules will expose it as public APIs, but it won't be in core. But sorry, someone else is probably needs access to the building, so I'm actually going to answer this real quick. Hello? Yeah. Oh yeah, can you let him up? Thanks. Bye. Normally I wouldn't do that, but that way that person can actually come up. So the async listener, the most useful use of this that I've seen so far and that I can think of is long stack traces. So there's a module that uses this right now, actually, because you can simulate it in user land right now, where it will save the stack trace before an event goes into C++ land and then restore it when it comes back out so it has the full stack trace instead of, as many of you were playing with Node probably noticed, when you try to do some async call and it throws an error, you only get like that small bit of the stack trace. This would allow you to grab everything. There are different ways of already doing that, but this is one of the things that this allows.
Did they say how expensive that is?
I don't know the performance impacts of this. For the discussions I read about it imply that this is more performant than other mechanisms for doing similar things, but I don't.
Those are all hacks.
Right, I don't know. There's this multi-context / virtual machine functionality. Right now, the only way to actually isolate your code from someone else's code so that they can't even like trade globals is to actually fork off the process with like a cluster module or something like that. There is a package called Contextify, and the example here is from that package specifically because I literally could not find an example of what's going to be in 0.12. I just know the functionality is going to be there. Finding examples of what's going to be in 12 is kind of hard right now.
Is this different than VM running context?
It's a similar thing.
It's slightly different in that it handles timeouts better because apparently there's some serialization that has to occur, but Contextify fixes that. And then the 2.0 or the 12 implementation is basically going to be Contextify, but that's the best that I could get out of the core guys.
Yeah, okay. So just to recap in case you didn't hear, there is a mechanism right now for running this, but Contextify is an actual Node package that made it work better with timers, and then Contextify is essentially being pulled into core, They said functionality based on, I don't know if they're copying code or not, but the same mechanism is going to be there. So it allows you to do things like this, where you can, within your same node process, run completely isolated chunks of code so that they can't interfere with each other, which is cool. CPU profiling, this is another thing I actually couldn't find a lot of information on. There are other ways to do CPU profiling right now, but this will be brought into core, and there's going to be this core V8 module that exposes it. I don't know what the output of this is. I couldn't find examples using it, and I didn't have time to compile master from source to actually try it. But supposedly this, I don't even know, maybe there's an end event as well that you call, or an end method. But it will provide that in a much more native way, which I imagine will be more performant and give you more accurate information anyway. And then you can also listen for an event of when garbage collection happens, just in case you need some logic to happen at that point. Not sure exactly when you would use that, but it sounds useful. Streams 3, and remember, we're progressing to things I find more interesting. So Streams 3 is really interesting because it's essentially Streams 2, and if you're not familiar, Streams 1 had, and that was a while ago in Node, had this, it was really based on event emitters, and that was the API you used to interact with it. So if you wanted to write your own stream, you had to listen to these events, which was okay, but it didn't work very well in certain situations, so they made Streams 2, which had a different API. And since they had Streams 2 and Streams 1, they needed a way for them to work together because they're both streams. But the way that that was implemented was essentially if Streams 2 ever acts like a Streams 1, then it's stuck in Streams 1 mode from then on, which basically just led to other problems, and it wasn't that great. So Streams 3 is Streams 2, but it interacts with Streams 1 flawlessly. Like they said they don't know of any issues caused by this new Streams 3 with interacting with the other two. So if you use a stream in 0.12, it will have these basically backwards compatible adjustments, whereas in old streams you would listen for a data event, often to actually grab anything. But now there's actually this read method used to pull it. Streams start paused, and you have to resume them. And that's nice because there were cases where you could invoke an action, you get a stream back, and then you try to pipe it to something else. But in between there, something happened, and you just lost that bit of data. So that's one of the problems. So that's why they start paused. That doesn't mean it doesn't send any data. It just means that that data is buffered until you actually request it. And pipe still works just like you would expect. It's just there's no more old mode and getting stuck in old mode, Streams 1 mode. So streams now are either flowing or they're paused. You called pause on it or you called resume, and that's it. So I think it makes a lot more sense. You don't have to worry about the differences. I didn't really worry about the differences before, but now I won't encounter problems because of them, so that's nice too. So it sounds like a good fix for that situation. And then, of course, my favorite is exec sync and spawn sync. There are basically, for a long time in Node, they would add sync methods for a lot of the APIs because there are situations where you just want to do sync. You don't care that it blocks. The only thing you're doing is waiting for that one asynchronous operation to finish before you do another one anyway. So why can't I just do sync when I want to? So that's through a lot of the Node API. But two notable exceptions are process management, exec and spawn, and HTTP. They still don't have a synchronous HTTP, but you can use a module like HTTP sync to get that. And the same with exec sync and spawn sync. There are modules that provide it, but it wasn't in core. Now it's actually going to be in core. So what that means is you can call exec sync, you can give it a program. I think that's actually not the right API, but it'll execute that process, wait for it to finish. Whatever comes back, it's going to give it back to you. And it's blocking your code so that you don't have to manage the asynchronous of it. Asynchrony. This is really nice for command line tools, and that's probably the only place I would recommend you use it, something like that. but it's great there. A lot of people are writing a lot of command line tools in Node these days. In Groupon, we have several, and they're just so much nicer to write with just sync, because you normally just want to do this, then this, then this. You're not often in a command line tool waiting for this to happen, doing this when those things happen, and not worrying about the intermediary steps. So I'm really excited about that part. That's about it. If you want this, I'll post up the slides, and there's some summaries. All of these are on Strong Loop, but there are some other places. But again, for the most part, it's sort of hard to find a lot of information about these. A lot of the discussion happens on IRC or pull requests. So if you're looking for more information, you might wind up on a pull request discussion. But as long as they get exec sync in there, I'm good. I don't think it's merged yet, or maybe. Like, most of the work is done, they say, but it's not quite guaranteed yet. But pretty excited about it. So, do you have any questions about Node.12?
Did you catch the Twitter stream about the error summit or whatever that a lot of the core guys went to in the past couple of weeks?
I didn't.
Okay, I saw something like Disha referenced 0.12 and regarding that, so I didn't know if you knew anything about if they're planning on changing general error handling.
I didn't hear anything about that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Does the process feel like it's finally settling down? And
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the, like I called the performance stuff the boring stuff, and as we progressed, we've got to actually things you could use, and there aren't a whole lot of them, like new things, I mean. And I think that's really indicative of we're just making things a little bit stronger. We aren't changing a whole lot. Like Streams 3 is literally just a change to make it backwards compatible with 1 and 2. And these performance improvements don't break any backwards compatibility for the most part. So, yeah, it almost feels like 0.12 is just a bug fix performance type of release. And 0.13 is explicitly that. So I definitely feel like we're winding down to a 1.0 where they're only going to make releases for small tweaks after that.
So
Yeah.
with the major version bump, they get the freedom of, if they use semver as they claim, which they don't. But if they
Yes.
do,
If they did.
Right.
they get the freedom to make breaking changes. I know there's a lot of things that Node developers want to make breaking changes for. Is
Yes.
that going to happen in 1.0, or are they just going to stay with like whatever's in 0.13 at the end?
I'm pretty sure 1.0 is going to be the cutoff of 0.13. I don't think 1.0 is going to introduce any breaking changes. If they want to do that, maybe 2.0 would be a place for that. But yeah, right now Node doesn't follow official semver, unless
Technically does, because the 0 ones you can do whatever you want.
that's what I was going to say. So they know it's being used in production all over the place. So responsible semver means they should have done 1.0 a long time ago. But technically semver does say 0.x means do whatever you want. So I don't find that useful. I don't consider that following semver necessarily. But technically, I guess, yeah, it does. But and semver, if you aren't familiar, is semantic versioning. It's an official spec for how you structure your version numbers and what they mean. But I have a whole blog post about all that if you want to go find out. But it's really interesting. Anyway, any other questions about Node.12 stuff? All right, cool.
I did have one.
Yeah.
Just I'm fairly new to the Node.js, so what was the previous release, and how rapidly do they come out?
Sure. So right now, the latest stable release is 0.10.26, 27? I don't remember. It's in that range. There is an 0.11, and those have releases too, but that's considered an unstable branch of Node, so you shouldn't use it in production. It's just for testing the new features before they become stable. As far as release cadence, I don't have like a graph of previous releases, but it feels like whenever they feel like they're ready. It's not on an official cadence, but we're getting close to 1.0, which is what a lot of people are, well, no one's really waiting for it. A lot of big companies are already using all kinds of Node, and it's definitely production ready. But 1.0 will be a good milestone, regardless. All right, cool. Just real quick, because semver, I think, is really important with a recent change. Semver.org describes the spec. It encourages 3 version numbers, a major, minor, and patch. Major means that you made backwards compatible breaking changes in your API. And some people don't consider output to be part of the API, but I do. That includes your return values or whatever your process outputs, in my opinion. Minor means that you added some functionality, but you did not break any backwards compatibility. And patch means it's just a bug or security fix for whatever's currently in there. You didn't add any features. Not many people follow this explicitly, especially in NPM, even though NPM sort of assumes you do. And that's sort of a point of contention. And not to plug myself too much, but I do have a blog post called The War of Semver, where I describe all of the arguments for a recent change where if you do npm install -- save and a module name, it used to, before this most recent change, it used to automatically add to your package.json tilde and whatever version number it found of that thing, whatever the latest one was. Now it adds caret and whatever that version number is.
Yeah,
and
that's actually my fault.
Oh, is that your fault?
Yeah, sorry.
Way to go.
That's why we have nice things.
I actually agree with the change, and for the various reasons I describe in here. But if you want, I encourage you to read this. This basically covers all of the arguments I could find, mostly on that pull request, but elsewhere. And basically, I come to the result that this is better for the community in general. But if you want to talk to me about that later, I could obviously go on about it.
So I do have a quick question for the guy back
Yep.
there. Was it just like a typing error that you put in there? Or was it have like
No, it deliberately is there because before the little squiggle it was stupid. I mean, there's 2 ways I could see it actually making sense. Right? This is the rationale for why it was a caret. You could either set it to nothing and just lock to a specific version, which is reasonable. But then what's the point of even having semver if no one's going to use it by default, right? Or the other version is you could say, use the most recent compatible version, which is what the caret means. And so, okay, use the most recent compatible version. The squiggle one only meant, match like most recent patch version, which doesn't make any sense at all. It's just stupid. So, why even use that?
I think it does. Well, we don't need to get into it. But yes, I agree that the caret is the best move forward. And if you're interested in the reasons why, check out. I linked to the pull request where this is all discussed in detail. But I also have my summary up. It's on massalabs.com.
How far back does the caret version support it? I tried to track it down once, and it wasn't clear.
It's in 10.16. I have the number in here.
Yeah, I think the real problem was they pushed that version of NPM, though, before 0.12. So what I was not expecting was that it was going to end up in 0.10, but I was thinking that it would eventually end up in 0.12, but I guess someone just said, okay, we'll just ship it with 0.10, and then everyone started complaining because the caret symbol was only added in NPM, or in the NPM version that shipped with 10.24. And so everyone who had 10 point something and then didn't upgrade over there, they all of a sudden got this breaking thing, and that was just...
Yes. It forces you to use a higher version of Node. Some of our projects are on 0.8, and they tried to upgrade a module, and it had a dependency that included a caret range, and that failed to install. So it created this problem. So I would want them to release an 0.8 update that included basically the updated NPM as well, so that it would support carets. But I think that's a definite stumble of this change. But overall, I think it's better. Other questions? So the other thing I wanted to talk about that someone mentioned on the comments.
oh,
Brian, that's you. So you wanted to know about game development and Easel.js specifically. I've actually used Easel.js, so I thought I would talk about it.
sweet.
Yeah. So yeah, game development in Node. It's something that a lot of people are doing. It's really interesting for several reasons. but I definitely don't consider myself like a game developer. I've made a couple of small projects and one project that's a little bit bigger, but nothing really serious. So these are my 3 like game dev projects. I just want to urge that I'm still a novice. These are just ideas that other novices might find useful. But just real quick, Mindwave was for a hackathon at the Adler Planetarium. I forget the name of the actual hackathon. But it was really cool because they had this device that you could put on your head, like a headset, and it would read your brain waves and it would emit them as JSON. And there were, yeah, it could have. So it was really cool because it had this dongle you plug in, and then you could just connect to it, and it just has a JSON stream. And there were, I forget, like 4 different brain waves, and it would just give you the frequency over time, which was really neat. So a friend of mine and I made a game where it's sort of like those rising platform games where you have to move and like fall in the hole, but the speed at which the platforms moved and the speed at which you moved were dependent on how calm you were. So if you started to get agitated or like afraid that you were going to like miss it, then it would get even harder, which was pretty fun. And I'll have links to these, and I have a demo video for each of them, so you can watch it and follow up there. So that was built in Node, but it was built for a hackathon over 2 days. Castle Riot was another hackathon that was actually Node Knockout 3. I don't remember. So again, 48 hours, but that was an interesting game where multiple people could connect to a map, and then you're either on the guard team or the thief team. So guards are trying to catch thieves, and thieves are trying to steal art from the castle and get out. So if they collide, then the guard has caught the thief, and they move at the same speed, but a thief has to find a painting on a wall first and get to an exit. And then the really interesting part that I liked about the game design was that guards had a flashlight, so they could see really far in front of themselves because it was normally dark, and thieves could only see in a small sphere around themselves, so it simulated this light situation. So even though they moved at the same speed, like I could see a thief as a guard farther away than he could see me, and there's a little bit of jumbling around to try and catch them. So it was actually fun to play. It was kind of cool. And then, but that was also a hackathon. This CCG engine is a card game engine that I'm making. This is a longer term thing that I just do like on random nights and whatnot. But it lets you play arbitrary card games like Magic the Gathering and other stuff like that, which is pretty cool. All of these written in Node, but again, I'm not a game developer, but I have examples you can look at of what I've done. I wanted to talk about some game developer concepts that are really important if you're just getting into this. The most important of which is the game loop. This is a function that is called every tick of your game. This is more useful for games that actually run on like a frames per second basis that actually care about that, not necessarily like you simulated a board game. It's not really going to care about rendering something 60 times a second or whatever. But in like an action game where this type of stuff matters, this is sort of a standard structure. It could be slightly different depending on your game engine or if you're writing it yourself. But the idea is that this function gets called based on some like FPS setting you want set. It's passed the amount of time that it has been since the last time the function was called, and then typically you call 2 like core other methods, one of which updates your models, your objects, whatever that means for your game, where all of your players are, what they're doing, whether or not they exist, bullets, stuff like that, everything. And you pass that in the delta time, and then you redraw the screen. So it's just the core of how a game operates, usually. In that update method, the reason you're past this delta time is you need to know like exactly how much time has passed. Even if you told your engine I want to fire 30 times a second, if your processing takes longer than your slice of time, it's not going to like cut you off. It's just going to wait until you're done and then call it again at 16 milliseconds minus how much you went over or something like that to try and keep it consistent. So that value can actually change. So that's important because if you don't take that into account, depending on how slow your game's operating, the speed of things on the screen is going to get out of sync. So if, for example, like you're moving a bullet and you want to take, it has a velocity and a specific direction, and you need to multiply that by that delta to get the actual distance it should travel between your game ticks, and then you apply that. So that's what this example shows. But it's just important to keep that in mind. So some old games, if you've ever played like a really old DOS game, those were built based on the speed of processors at the time, and if you play them now, sometimes they just go super fast. You don't understand why. It's because they aren't accounting for the actual time difference. They're just assuming that it's been, I have a 200 megahertz processor and I should be this far, for example. So this is important. There's also this concept of the source of truth. And when you're messing with this client-server architecture, you basically have to protect yourself for anything that's like a spike where you're just playing around. Don't worry about this too much, but just keep it in mind. But the idea is that if I am playing some game, I'm at my browser or whatever, and I look at the code or the network tab and I see all of these connections going back to the server, they have a specific structure, I could simulate that. Like I could just make my own little system that starts emitting the same events. But maybe I start lying and say that my position's actually over here, or I perform this action when I normally wouldn't be able to. So your server has to, there are different architectures you could choose, but you need to prevent that in some way. So you can either have the server be the absolute source of truth, and whatever the client does, you just send that command to the server, processes, and then the server sends back what you should see. So that's pretty nice because the server has all the logic. You don't have to worry about much of anything. The problem is you're going to have that latency between action and result. You could do some presumption where, like, I did this action on the client, I know it should do something like this. The server will update it more accurately when it gets back, but it gets more complicated. Or you can have the logic in both places, just make sure that the server's validating it and it's not allowing someone to cheat. So maybe the exact same logic happens, so you have that faster response, but if someone submitted an invalid action, the server would eventually, by eventually I mean pretty quick, but it would come back and update your UI in some way saying you can't do that, or move you back a couple of pixels because you aren't supposed to be there yet, or whatever it is. This also helps with losing synchronization between server and clients, making sure that the problem is if your client moves you 4 pixels to the left and the server knows you should have been moved 4 pixels to the left, but that was 0.002 seconds ago, and it starts to get out of sync. And then at some point, the server is telling other people that you're here, but on your screen, you're actually over here. You want to keep track of stuff like that. Yeah.
I'm feeling a little bit lost as far as kind of the overview of what this library is. I don't know if...
I'm just talking in general about games.
Oh, just in general. Okay,
yes.
Gotcha.
About game development. I'm not talking about a specific library at all.
Okay.
You have a question about this, using sync?
Yep.
If the server is this source of truth and the server and client are supposed to be acting the same, when the client gets back more authoritative information from the server and updates what the client is rendering, that information might also be out of date, so that you might be like not cheating or whatever, just with a slower connection, and if you're walking to the left, maybe you won't be as far to the left when you get this authoritative answer, but really you didn't do anything wrong.
Yes, there are much more complex algorithms for dealing with that I don't know. I do know that MMOs especially have this problem because the latency between people could be huge, and there's all kinds of different people, and if there's a lot of load on the servers, things can get out of sync. I know that specifically World of Warcraft has 3 different positions for you. I don't remember all of them, but it's like where your client thinks you are, where the server thinks you are, and there's like a third one, and it creates some sort of like average between them, and it like manages it in this complex way. I don't know the exact algorithm, but I know that it worked incredibly well. Like World of Warcraft had the best position that I've ever played in a game, an MMO specifically. Sometimes you'll play games where you'll like all of a sudden jump back like 10 feet, called rubber banding, and that's when the server is like asserting like, no, you're actually here, because they got out of sync. That almost never happened in World of Warcraft. It was really quite amazing.
Kind of ruins a certain like games that don't do that to a certain extent.
Oh, yeah.
Once you get used to not seeing the rubber banding all over the
Mhm.
place.
Yeah, so it's definitely complicated, and I don't know the algorithms that they use, but it's apparently a solvable problem, which is good. But it's very complex. Another interesting thing I found when making games is that a lot of people cite that Node.js is awesome because it lets you share code between the client and server, to which I say bullshit. That's so incredibly rarely happens in web development that I'm pretty sure I've never done it. Like, I can't remember specifically, explicitly doing that on a real project. Yeah, nothing's coming to mind. It's a nice idea. There are definitely situations where that can be useful and that you even should do it. But in games specifically, I've actually started to find more reasons to do that, including mostly model objects. Like, I want to share the player model between both, so that they, when it's like serialized across, they like exist in the same way. And again, depending on your client-server architecture, maybe both of them execute the logic, and then the server might update you a little bit. So you need that code in both places. I just found it happening more often than none in web development. So I thought that was interesting. And that is something that Node.js specifically is going to allow you to do, as opposed to rewriting your logic once in JavaScript, once in Ruby, once in Scala, whatever your backend is.
Now that you have a code sharing hammer, do you see any code sharing shaped nails in web development that you wouldn't have before?
That's a good question. I still don't. Like, I don't. Like, there are some, like, the example people usually give is you can share validation logic for fields and whatnot, and sure, you could, but I don't really mind writing again that this must be a series of digits. Like, it's not, like, it almost seems too dry, so dry that you're chafing, some people might say, that I've not found it useful. I'm sure in some situations some other people have.
I'll hopefully be providing the counter argument to this in an upcoming meetup,
Awesome.
assuming that it doesn't blow up in my face.
Yeah. I've never really played with stuff like this before. Like, Meteor does a lot of sharing between both. I've played with trying to implement Backbone on the server so that it acted as not only your web server, but also could render the client-side code and take over, so that you had a seamless, everything was written in Backbone, but you had a seamless transition between first load and subsequent loads. And stuff like that's interesting. It just didn't turn out to be like production worthy at the time. Maybe now, maybe with whatever you're working on. I definitely want to see it. I think it's a cool idea.
Other works like that.
Yeah.
I'm going to wait until it gets into production before I
That's fair. That's
commit to
fair.
anything.
How do you actually share the code between the, because it's different
That's a
than
great
different code
question.
bases.
That's a great question.
Like, I did it with config data, where there's like a bootstrap
Hmm.
all that sends back an object, but I never found how do you share code?
Yeah.
Just opening up a socket and saying, "Hey, here's the file. Have fun."
Yeah, you're like sending a string
That's
of
not how I do it. But you could, I guess, if you want to eval it in the end. So sharing code, this is actually something that I could also talk at length about. Not because I use this technique regardless, but you could also use it to share code, which is using something like Browserify or CommonJS Everywhere, something that gives you that CommonJS format in your client-side code. And those two tools specifically will allow you to require stuff directly out of your node modules or arbitrary paths. So in instances where I did this, in my client-side code, I just said require over to a server module, and then grab the player object model or whatever it was. And that's it.
Just need to create an entry file for your browser version.
In CommonJS Everywhere, yeah.
Oh, assuming.
Yeah. So I use those tools regardless of sharing code because CommonJS is the best format, and I want to use it everywhere. That's the name, CommonJS Everywhere. But I've heard that more recent versions of Browserify are also awesome. I've not tried Browserify 3, but one of the reasons that you even wrote CommonJS Everywhere is because Browserify was not up to the task at the time. Maybe now it is. I don't know. But regardless, as I find that to be a great way to share code when you do want to. I would not suggest like trying to shove it over a WebSocket and evaling it or something like that. because for the most part, you would know ahead of time, like this client-side code cares about my player model, and this server-side code cares about my player model. So when I generate my client-side bundle, it's already there. One of the things you have to be careful of, and that's also regardless of sharing code, is just if you're trying to use a Node module that's trying to use some like native extensions or something like that, that's not going to end up working for you unless you build some crazy mscripting compiling thing, and I would never suggest that. That sounds awful. Other questions about sharing code? This is an amazing idea. So WebSockets are definitely the way to go when you're building these games for communicating back and forth. I'm talking about Node and a browser specifically, in case that wasn't clear. If you were using something else that wasn't a browser, then I would not use WebSockets. WebSockets are only for communicating with browsers. If you're using it for something else, then you're probably just using an inferior tool for whatever that is. Like on Node, you can open UDP sockets, TCP sockets, and communicate that way. And you should just do that. But to a browser, WebSockets, definitely awesome. Socket.io is this tool that I've used several times. I actually use it in all three of those examples I mentioned before. Some people recently have basically slammed Socket.io for reasons I don't understand. I still like it. It falls back to other browsers that don't work with WebSockets. It'll fall back to using Flash to communicate. It'll fall back to using like Ajax polling and stuff like that. It's really nice. But this is just a brief overview of the important parts of the API. Basically, you set it up on the client and the server, and then after this connection happens, you can use emit to send data from one to the other. You can use broadcast.emit to send data from myself to all other clients, which can be useful, especially in like multiplayer games and stuff like that. But the other really useful piece, which it would really be a shame if this didn't exist, but luckily it does, is you can namespace these things. You can basically scope them. So I actually do this. This is a chunk I pulled from one of my projects, is when you create separate games and like only 2 people are connected to this game, 3 people are connected to this game, you scope the WebSocket communication for this game to just other clients here. So that way, if you want to use socket.broadcast.emit, it's only going to broadcast it among those people and not affect your other games. So that's how you would do something like that. But basically, if you're going to use Node and browser to make a game, you probably want to use Socket.io or something like it that will provide some sort of WebSocket communication. And if it is just raw WebSockets, it's going to have a similar mechanism, but obviously this is Socket.io specific. I would just start with this, and then if you need to go down to something else later, you can figure it out. So now I want to talk about some specific tools. On one of my projects, the MindWave one, I used Easel.js. On another, I used this tool called Jaws.js, which I would not recommend. But first, let's take a look at these. So Easel.js is part of this larger suite that does a couple of different things, but Easel is like the spriting of everything. They also have a separate library for sound and a couple other things. This is one of the demos for it. It's just showing you how you can use sprite sheets to create animations and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. And this was actually the example I used for basically getting started with using this library. So this is the tool or the game that we wrote using Easel.js. I'm just going to show a quick clip of this demo just to show what it looks like. So it's showing your brainwaves on the side. And I forget. Oh, the text is there just for fun. It doesn't mean anything. But the speed of everything will change based on. We grouped them into attention and meditation, but it actually provides more than that. But it's just kind of cool. Just to show something that Easel.js can do. The other demos on this are impressive as well. So this is definitely a strong tool. It lets you do a lot of different things without writing all of these animations and sprite sheeting and stuff yourself. So if you want to see how we use it, again, this is a hackathon. The code in here I wouldn't recommend anyone study and teach in schools or anything like that. But if you want an example of how you can use these things, you can definitely take a look at that. I'm not going to give like an actual intro into Easel.js, but I will definitely answer any questions, especially that you might have about it. But I found Easel.js to be pretty nice to work with, especially with these examples. Like you can look at the code for them and see how they work and then work off of that. That is sort of the opposite experience that I had with JAWS. I don't even remember why we chose this one, but for some reason we did. And this does a similar thing. It's mostly about sprite sheets. It has examples down here, but they're all not nearly as impressive as, that's like the most impressive one is just showing some parallax scrolling. But for the most part, it's really simple boxes. Some collision detection, like it's still useful. It's just, I don't know, I found it much harder to work with. I'll show the game real quick. Although what's interesting is I think we made a more interesting game with this one, but not because the tool allowed it to happen. So this is the important part. So you basically see this circle, and that's the thief because he only has this vision around him. And you can see yourself only on the minimap on the bottom, so you could have some context of where you are. And then this is the guard that's catching people with the flashlight, and you can see. So that was fun, but that was with JAWS. But again, I really just wouldn't recommend it. It doesn't seem to be, I don't know, not nearly good enough. We had to do like way too much ourselves, and it didn't really help out that much. It did help, but not that much. So again, I'll have the slides up, and you can take a look at these later. But does anyone have any questions? These are just a couple of guys who'd never really done game dev before, diving into one of these libraries and figuring out how it works and building something in 48 hours for the most part for the two examples there.
Super.
Yep.
Has most of your research involved using the browser for the actual visualization of the game?
Yeah.
Have you heard of anything that actually lets the node process itself push to the graphics card?
Yes. So if you want to make like a desktop game where Node is your backend and everything else, but you're actually drawing visuals in some other way, there are projects that help you that interface with like X11 and whatnot to actually render something to the screen. And people have written like their own window managers and whatnot in Node. So something like that is possible. I don't know a lot of examples of actually using Node as a backend for a game that's a desktop game like that, other than things where people just use Node WebKit or something, which isn't really what you're asking. But Node WebKit's a different tool that allows you to basically extracts just the browser page part of a browser and combines that with Node and gives you this nice little package thing you can run on your desktop, so you can still write client-side JavaScript and Node and communicate the way you normally would, but it's this packaged thing that you can use.
So have you ever worked with webhooks or REST hooks?
Webhooks or REST hooks?
Yeah.
For...
So we're talking about sockets, and I haven't actually had enough chance to look into those, but apparently it's something like that ish.
It's analogous to sockets. I've not heard of that. When you say webhooks and REST hooks, I think of services like GitHub that let you hook into events and communicate with each other, but those are just post events usually happening between servers. I don't know of anything analogous to actual WebSockets that are called that. Do you have a question?
I didn't know if you had any digestible code that handled the clock on the server, if the server is doing anything with the clock. Put you on the spot.
For the most part, the server in our games weren't managing time.
Okay.
So there's definitely going to be issues there at some point over a longer game or something. But the clients were doing okay. We actually ended up using some really stupid algorithms for managing that. One of them Yeah, I think for Castle Riot, at one point we were sending your exact position like 60 times a second, and I don't know why we thought that was a good idea, but it didn't really work out that well.
That would be my first line of approach to that. What
Sure. It was just trying too much to send too much, and the server would actually lag behind, and we were probably doing some stupid blocking thing that was interrupting it as well. I don't know, but then we went to like 4 times a second, and that was too little. But no one ever updated it. So it would do some predictive movement. So instead of the client telling the server or vice versa where you are, the client would say, I'm moving left. That is my position right now, moving left. So the client, like every tick, would say, move you left at this velocity by this delta. And this, only when you changed direction did the client actually send its position to the server to broadcast to other people. So basically, both clients just knew that the player was moving left and drew them independently. And then when you change direction, it like sort of jerks a little, and then they were moving up. So it was okay, but we needed a hybrid or something else to work out better than that. But we ran out of time to mess with it. Other questions about game dev stuff? I'm not a seasoned game developer. These are just the things that I came up with.
Well, I mean, regarding the update loop, I mean, you don't have to like render every time you pick the game, so you can actually have like the ticks run at like a fixed frequency, and then just draw like frames whenever like a request animation or event or whatever comes up. And if you do that, then you don't have to deal with like the weird sort of like over or under configuration when you do some variable delta thing, and your game will become deterministic on all clients and on the server. And then you just have to interpolate between like the last 2 ticked frames. You get an actual update. And if you do that, your animation is completely smooth, and you have like a regular clock that you update.
You can't assume that it's a regular clock, right? On lower end hardware, it might not. You might miss intervals.
Yeah, well then if the hardware is so slow that you can't tick the game, like say 30 frames per second, or 30 ticks per second or whatever, like fast enough, then you can do one of 2 things. You can either just throttle the game back and just run it at a lower frequency, and the game will have to run slower because the system just can't keep up with it, right? Or you can have something where if like the time for ticks is variable, you can have something where maybe you just skip a bunch of frames. If you have like say like a big physics event or whatever that goes off, and you just have like a moment where you just pause the game and just wait a certain number of ticks until you can actually keep up and start rendering it on, right? Like the solution to that is to decouple rendering from updating. And actually that's also kind of necessary for a network game, because if you want to have things where you have asynchronous events going on in the network, you generally need to update the state independent from the rate at which you take the game. And usually the rate at which you update is going to be much, much slower than the rate at which you render it, especially in a network environment, because usually like 10 updates a second is good enough.
Yeah, that's fair. I didn't mention request animation frame, which is important. It's in newer browsers, and it will allow you to handle that timing and not have to do it yourself, which is also great because then you aren't causing updates that the browser has to render separately from when it normally would want to. But yeah, you definitely want to decouple. At a certain rate, at a certain point, we started to realize that we needed to decouple updating our model of the universe and actually drawing it. And the traditional game loop is more appropriate in situations where you have to draw to the screen multiple times, whereas in a browser, I could just do nothing, and that DOM element or whatever it is still there, so I don't need to redraw it. But yeah, there are definite ways to make that better.
It's interesting. Because so far when I'm like looking at it, like I'm looking at like different tile sheets too. Like for the castle, right? How did you guys do like for like the background? Did you guys just have it all made already, or are you just calling different tiles to put out there?
The background is just one image that was pre-made. It had a mask, a collision mask, that defined what you could walk over and what you could not. But yeah, it was just an image that already. We built the image with a little tile editor thing, so we could use this sprite sheet that we had to actually construct it. But once we had it, it's just an image.
Was the collision mask a single pixel on the mask is mapping to one tile that like a user can fit in there? Or were you doing things like you could have a angled wall that they would bounce off of?
Sure. The collision mask, I'm pretty sure we did just based on tiles instead of actual pixels. So even though you could move freely, you were still bounded exactly by this tile, not being able to walk into it. So if you were sort of on the edge, sometimes it looked a little weird because you couldn't go up, but it was because you were like 1 pixel overlap or something with that tile, for example.
So that was custom code that you wrote to do that? That wasn't a library or?
I don't remember if the engine provided that or not. I think it provided that mechanism, so we just had to define the mask. I'd have to check the code, but I don't even remember where to look in the code at this point. Actually, everything, since it was a hackathon, everything's like in one file anyway. Oh no, not this one. We actually split it out a lot. It's cool. Oh yeah, this was a fun trick. This was back when I was using Browserify. It was a long time ago. And Browserify would let you require things from Node modules. So I, in our client folder, made a Node modules folder so that when you were in there, let's find an example. Yeah, you could require a game. It would look inside of Node modules, which is just another module I have, game, and it would require that instead.
You don't have to do that with Browserify. You can just give it a relative path, just like in Node.
I didn't want to. So the problem was, in client-side code, there is no core library I'm requiring from. So an unrooted path doesn't mean anything in client-side code. I wanted to make it mean something. So I wanted to basically say, I don't care where I am in the file system. That doesn't matter to me. I want to require my game module. So that way I don't have to have anything preceding. I can just say required game. I could say required game / index or game / player or whatever. Because
you didn't want to use relative paths.
Yes.
To put everything in Node modules.
Yes, because relative paths are just annoying. In CommonJS everywhere, you can specify a specific root path where if you use an unrooted require, it will look there as one of its options. And that's what I use now to do the same type of thing. I wouldn't recommend doing that all the time. It's just when I write CommonJS code, I try to reduce the number of times you go .. because that means that you're requiring something else outside of the scope of this module, this directory you've defined. And sometimes you sort of have to, but for the most part, you can usually reorganize your code so you don't have to do that. And it usually makes for a better structure, in my opinion. But in the rare case, when I at least do that, I don't want to have to care about where that is relative to the current module in the file system. Like that part isn't important to me, especially when I move it and then I have to remove all the references. That's not important to me.
Yeah, but that is how Node does it, though. I mean, Node, you can't specify.
Correct.
Use this as Node. So, I mean, the rationale, I think, for the way Browserify does it is that it wants to be compatible with Node's module system.
It's still compatible the way I do it. It's just
if you specify
extended.
one of those root paths, though, then that's not going to follow the same Node module resolution algorithm.
Not if there's a collision. Correct. So yeah, I mean, it could cause a problem in that case, but it's not something that I'm worried about in my projects. But I definitely understand why you wouldn't add that, but it just seems so incredibly useful for me that that was one of the reasons I actually wanted to use this tool, is because it provided this functionality. In my perfect system, I would actually use tilde for that functionality, like required tilde / would be your project root. But it doesn't matter. Other questions about game development?
I guess what was the card game engine?
Oh, the card game engine, yeah.
Some of the kind of crap I'm working
Oh,
on.
yeah? I'm not really ready to talk about it too much. It is public. You can find it. I'm not recommending anyone use it for anything at the moment, but this is all custom, completely custom. There's no engine. And because I mean, it doesn't really need one. There aren't like sprite sheets you have to manage and whatnot. Actually, I think I have a version deployed. Oops, I mistyped it. So this is what it is so far. You can draw cards into your hand. You can play them onto the field. You can tap them. If another player connects, they'll see everything except for the other player's cards in the field right now. I'm still messing with that. But you have to enforce all the rules for whatever game it is, but it'll at least let you play back and forth with someone. But yeah, that's all entirely custom. There's no timing issues. It's just, like, it's all event-based, so it's a little bit different from the other things I was describing. Other questions? All right, well, that's all that I have. If anyone else wants to talk about anything, we can. If you want to show a quick demo of something you're working on, or if you have questions about Node in general. No? All right, well, thanks for coming, everyone. That's it.